the lecture. It's on psychoanalysis and the visual arts, which is a topic of my book, which Cleo just translated into Serbian. Almost from its origins, psychoanalysis has been applied outside the clinical sphere to works of art and used as a mode of understanding. Let's think about three modes of major concern to people interested in the arts. First, the nature of creative work and the life histories of artists. How does art grow out of an artist's life? Second, what about the interpretation of works of art? Can psychoanalysis help us to understand puzzling elements of works of art? 3, the nature of our encounters with works of art. Why do we care about art? How do works of art impact us? Why do we prefer some works rather than others? Unlike the clinical psychoanalyst, the writer who applies psychoanalytic ideas to art has no therapeutic goal. When he or she interprets art of the distant past, there is no interpersonal context for evolving transferences. Then, in the absence of live interpersonal exchange, interpretation in the realm of art lacks the intersubjective validation fundamental to clinical practice. Yet, even when the object of inquiry is not a live human being, there continues to be a dialogue. No, for works of art do answer back to us when we pay attention to them. And the finest of them, the greatest of them, are endowed with a transhistorical power to co-create and transform, even if transiently, their viewers and their audiences. Therefore, they are best seen as relational rather than fixed. Nevertheless, the psychoanalytic interpreter of art differs from the practicing analyst in his or her motives, methods, and goals. Over the years, boundary issues have interfered with positive reception on the part of scholars in other disciplines toward psychoanalysts who have wandered into the aesthetic domain, and toward non-analysts who have tried to import psychoanalysis into the realm of art. These boundary issues are due to territorialism in its most primitive form, protective defenses against the invasion of what is perceived as one's own rightful space, and failures on the part of psychoanalytically informed authors to specify the limits to their projects. Often, I think, they claim too much. Some outsiders to psychoanalysis, therefore, consider these analytic forays into their territory as presumptuous. By the same token, some practicing psychoanalysts reject non-clinical academic authors as superficial or hyper-intellectual and claim they draw on psychoanalytic theory mechanically, without really understanding it. And the dangers, always the same dangers, are superficiality and premature closure. I get it. Sometimes in my teaching, I find it helpful to present examples of psychoanalysis when it's treated formulaically and objects reductively beheld. So it sort of becomes reductionistic. Because I think if my students can see the bad stuff and recognize the bad way, they will find a better way. So here is a painting. You see this painting? It's an American romantic landscape by a painter called Thomas Cole, 19th century painter. And here is a psychoanalytic reading, which I think is completely absurd. I'm quoting this author. I wish I had my pointer to show you, but I don't think I really need it. The narcissistic assertion of the foreground promontory in its extension into the middle ground heap is muted into a more clearly Oedipal rivalry between the foreground and middle ground planes. And the narcissism of an earlier painting has been replaced by an erotic object attachment, an attempt at both identification and rivalry along Oedipal lines. Despite the maternal promises of the distant meadowlands, the deepest affective moments remain centered around the male-male conflict of a central space. The males in question must be landscape elements, because there are no human figures in the painting. Trees, hills, peaks acquire human gender and generational conflict. And the notion of narcissism seems egregiously misplaced. And the results sound silly. Silly. Theory cannot be mapped onto any painted image. And reading something like that, we can understand how interdisciplinary work earns distrust. However, when psychoanalytic theory as an approach to art is grounded and combined sensitively with other approaches, joined with qualitatively rich experiences with artworks, the interdisciplinary marriage can bear fruit, and the unique contribution of psychoanalysis to the realm of the aesthetic is made manifest. One example of such excellence is by a British art historian called Margaret Iverson. Her book, published in 2008, is called Beyond Pleasure. It offers a brilliant, carefully researched discourse on the then 21-year-old Maya Lin's 1983, this is the artist, minimalist, conceptualist, incredibly moving Vietnam War memorial design in Washington, D.C. Iverson makes use of the psychoanalytic notion of the fetish to explicate the ways in which a public monument can serve both to disavow traumatic knowledge and at the same time induce memories of trauma by standing simultaneously for and against. Drawing on the work of another psychoanalyst, Julia Kristeva. Iverson is really not a psychoanalyst, she's an art historian. Kristeva, as you know, is a psychoanalyst. She makes use of the image of a scar, which heals, but maintains ever after the path of the original gash or wound. And she quotes another psychoanalyst, Octave Manoni, who writes, "I know that the fetish I know, but all the same," to develop her depiction of Maya Lin's work in the context of the political and ideological battles that raged and stormed around it, mirroring the already deep rifts that split America American culture in the wake of that wasteful war. Citing Freud's 1910 fantasy about an imaginary Londoner who pauses in sorrow before a monument to a former queen in London, Queen Eleanor of Castile, Charing Cross in London, rather than attend to his present love. Margaret Iverson asks whether the purpose or the fate of such a monument is actually to foster what she calls the necessary act of forgetting, or the necessary art of forgetting. Telling her reader the precise moment at which tears filled her eyes when she walked along the wall for the first time, she reveals how Maya Lin's monument negotiates passages between private grief and the highly polished black granite reflecting each mourner's face as he or she passes by each name on the wall, and public mourning. With the help of psychoanalysis, she demonstrates how Maya Lin's stark design acts like a lightning rod, she calls it a lightning rod, for all the emotions that continue to swirl around the Vietnam War. Anger and outrage against the American government. Such feelings and attitudes, she argues, are, by virtue of the monument's design, I'm quoting, displaced onto issues of aesthetics, modernism against tradition, abstraction against figurative art. Iverson's interpretive work stands as an exemplary model of the application of psychoanalysis to visual art. Thoughtful, heartfelt, original, and inspiring. So this is a three-part paradigm. Following the paradigm that I mapped out in Art and Psyche, this book, which you have now here, we divide our inquiry into three areas identified already: artistic creativity, the interpretation of works, and the nature of audience response. Each of these topics correlates with a chapter in the development of the history of psychoanalysis. And also, each question correlates with a chapter in the development of criticism, history of criticism. Freud, in 1922, said the best way to understand psychoanalysis is to study its origins and history. Following his counsel, we may take the evolution of psychoanalysis in its relation to the arts as falling into this three-part sequence, beginning with the studies on hysteria, the interpretation of dreams, in which Freud reports his discovery of the dynamic unconscious, develops his notions of mental conflict, repression, repetition, transference, and offers a topographic model of the mind. Unconscious, preconscious, conscious. In this first stage, Freud views artistic form as a pleasurable disguise, a mask. However elaborate, for content originally derived from forbidden wishes, both erotic and aggressive. With the development of ego psychology, stage 2, by Anna Freud, Heinz Hartmann, Ernst Kriss, and others, the viewpoint toward art shifts. Now, rather than taking the buried, disguised, wishful content of art as our focus, it is the elaboration of artistic form that comes to light. And our new question now has to do with how does form arise? And according to some, form is thought of as representing the relatively autonomous functioning of the ego. In other words, some aspects of artistic form may arise more or less independently of wishes and instinct and drive. And finally, with the advent of object relations theory, stage 3, as exemplified in the writings of Margaret Mahler in the United States, the British-based authors Melanie Klein, D.W. Winnicott, Hannes Segal, Marion Milner, and others, aesthetic experience is traced back to a young child first relationship, to symbiosis, separation, individuation, to play, to transitional objects and phenomena, and to things and sounds that evoke the qualities of this formative relationship. In this model, works of art are seen as representing what Winnicott called an intermediate area of experience between the self and the outside world. And aesthetic form and content fuse. Any attempt to separate them is seen as depriving the work of art of its status as art. Can these three approaches be integrated, or are they incompatible? I think unification is feasible, because in the case of the artist's relation to his work, a classical Freudian approach makes sense, because it traces, by studying the artist's life, the putative intrapsychic conflicts that have motivated or infiltrated the work of art. Here, however, ego functions also have their place because they relate to media, method, and style, and object relations as well. In the case of interpretation, also, psychology and object relations theory are primary, because ego psychology and object relations theory are primary because they concern unconscious fantasy that involves both ego and id. And this matters because when we interpret psychoanalytically, we are searching surface and depth and seeking all the wily ways that these categories resist and defy their reification. Object relations theory, because of its developmental perspective, has much to say regarding aesthetic response. So the three approaches can serve as mutually interdependent interpretive modes. Artists step back from works in progress to appraise them critically and revise them. The artist is the first critic of his own work. Likewise with critics. This, of course, is Daumier. Their perceptual acuity, their inventiveness, their knowledge, and their unconscious fantasy determine the quality of their judgments. When you go to the newspaper to read an art critic, you want them to have a lot there. Otherwise, you don't want to believe this criticism. Audience members resonate in fantasy with many aspects of the art they behold. Hence, although we separate, I am separating these categories for the purpose of a lecture or for the purpose of academic discourse, what actually happens during creation, criticism, and aesthetic experience involves all of that, all of this, all of it. And the differences probably consist in emphasis, each mode implicit in the others. And a parallel interdependence is observed in psychoanalysis. Early drive theory involves a recognition of something in conflict with the drive, later to be developed into ego psychology. In ego psychology, there is an awareness of the drives and the wishes out of which the unconscious fantasies are made and against which the defenses are mobilized. The analysis of a drive always involves a concern with its object, as well as its aim, its impetus, and its source. Thus, object relations theory is inextricably tied to the earlier paradigms from which it springs. And we may regard these modes as parts of a whole with varying stresses. And art criticism shifts among expressive, objective, and phenomenological modes, just as romantic, formalist, response theory, and all of these modes of criticism are also mutually dependent. Because of its absorption into 21st century intellectual and cultural life, psychoanalysis, I think, now plays, although often not openly, in concert with them, a significant role. Freud's interest in art is best documented by his Antiquities collection. This is, of course, a photograph of his desk, which from Berggasse 19 in Vienna, but now in Maresfield Gardens in London, after he fled from the Nazis in 1938. Freud wrote, "I have sacrificed a great deal for my collection of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian antiquities," in a letter he wrote in 1938. And actually, he wrote, "have read more archaeology than psychology," as well as by his book, papers devoted to art, and the many references scattered throughout his works. Although his perspectives evolved, however, his artistic taste never did, and he never systematized his cultural theories. His major concern, with very few exceptions, is with the relation between the artist's inner life and his artistic product. Freud sees the cultural object as expressive of and as the result of internal themes and conflicts. Freud said, "Art brings about a reconciliation between two principles, pleasure and reality. An artist is originally a man who turns away from reality because he cannot come to terms with the renunciation of instinctual satisfaction, which reality demands, and who allows his erotic and ambitious wishes full play in the light of fantasy. He finds his way back to reality, however, from this world of fantasy by making use of special gifts, talents, to mold his fantasies into truths of a new kind, which are valued by men as precious reflections of reality." Through art, in other words, one actually becomes the king, the hero, or the chosen beloved of one's dreams, but without expending all the energy that you would have to use in the real world, and without the luck needed to succeed. The artist's success depends on the fact that others, the rest of us, share this dissatisfaction. No one wants to replace the pleasure principle with the reality principle. Art gives us ersatz gratification. It gives us temporary but highly satisfactory wish fulfillment. And moreover, it is sanctioned by the surrounding culture. This formulation, I think, Freud's formulation, stands up quite well when we apply it to 21st century popular art, including commercial art, advertising art, movies, television shows, as well as video games. If we take those to be a species of popular art. I think for the young people they are. Freud's formulation works less well for the fine art of our day that focuses on political and ideological themes and mocks aesthetic gratification as an artistic goal. This is a piece by a very prominent African-American artist called Fred Wilson. The piece is called Guarded View. And the piece is a political piece which is pointing out the fact that in the great museums of my country, the people who are going to the exhibitions are fair-skinned people, and the guards who are guarding the works of art are the black people. So it's called Guarded View. And the figures have no heads. They don't have a chance to look at the art. They're only standing there. This is a political piece. I don't think that Freud is relevant for this kind of piece. Freud also emphasizes communication. Interestingly, he concurs in this with his older contemporary, Tolstoy, who wrote the famous work, What is Art?, in 1898. For both of these thinkers, the value of aesthetic experience comes from identification. However, we must be careful. Freud does not say that the specific latent content of an artist's work must be mirrored by or even revealed to the viewer. The object of identification that matters, as Freud sees it, is far more subtle. It is nothing more nor less than the quintessential process of circumventing the censor. What delights the audience and constitutes the essence of aesthetic experience is, for Freud, the successful outwitting of the censor by making possible the gratification of wishes and fantasy. This is what gives us our deepest pleasure in art, according to Freud. So, while instinct and wishes lie at the core of art, their elaboration into form by the special gifts, as he says, of the artist, brings about a convergence of reality and pleasure and provides grounds for identification and communication. Speculatively, but persuasively, at least for me, Freud, in 1908, in a very excellent paper, traces a path from children's imaginative play. This is a painting by American artist Thomas Eakins, 19th century American painter. He traces a line from children's imaginative play through daydreaming and fantasy to the work of artists. In various writings, he underscores the continuity of art with other modes of mental function, such as jokes and dreams. The artist exists on a continuum with others who are not artists. And Freud writes, "May we not say that every child at play behaves like a creative writer or an artist, in that he creates a world of his own, or rather rearranges the things of his world in a new way which pleases him." This Freudian image of a child artist rearranging objects in unique configurations paves the way for Winnicott and others who have elaborated the derivation of artistic activity from childhood play. And Freud's image also prefigures theories about the experiences of audiences for art. This is because when art seems new and compelling, it challenges us to reorient ourselves. It charges us to reconceive phenomena in new ways that disrupt our previous assumptions. It confronts us with truths heretofore unacknowledged, and with fresh possibilities for the fusion of inner and outer realities. Art puts us, in other words, into the place of a child who is experimenting, and it forces us to create our world, or at least some aspects of it, anew. So I think it's very important for those who want to attack Freud for taking art merely as a way of circumventing prohibition by permitting instinctual gratification. Freud was profoundly respectful of the potential of art to bring us in touch with inner truths, and he was not oblivious to his own cursory treatment of artistic form. He apologizes for example, in the opening paragraph of his paper on the Moses of Michelangelo. He says, "I am no connoisseur of art, but simply a layman. The subject matter of works of art has a stronger attraction for me than their formal and technical qualities, although to the artist their value lies first and foremost in these. I am unable rightly to appreciate many of the methods used and the effects obtained in art." Nevertheless, he speculates on the nature of artistic form by asking us to consider why is it when an ordinary person tells us a daydream, we feel bored, but when a gifted artist tells us a daydream or shows us a daydream, we experience intense delight. He makes the analogy of the pleasure of artistic form. He uses a sexual analogy to sexual foreplay, gives pleasure of its own while readying us for the greater pleasure we feel from the full expression of release of sexual tension. He proposes that the artist's work provides a kind of model, and he says, enabling us to enjoy our own dreams without self-reproach or shame. Form and content work hand in hand, and art at its strongest liberates audiences by empowering us to dare to enter into more intimate contact with our own internal worlds, unlocking boundaries. And this idea, which intends to explain how it is that art can have such dramatic effects on us, whether it's theater or opera or music or painting or sculpture, constitutes, I think, Freud's most telling contribution to the philosophy of art. And I think it's a contribution highly pertinent to much art of our time, although not all. Art that takes risks, shocks into awareness, and opens technically and conceptually onto new horizons, which are the hallmarks of this new century. Today's art brings sensations of human selves that fluctuate and metamorphose, not only geographically through exile and immigration, but physically. One thinks of the disturbing work of the French performance artist Orlan, who in the 1990s, some of you perhaps know her work, in the 1990s she underwent a series of plastic surgeries in order to transform herself, thus critiquing the enslavement of women to ideals of beauty. We have prostheses, hormonally, surgically induced gender changes, and cyborg. And Freud's actual taste in art, while highly cultivated, was retrograde. He clung to the plastic arts of antiquity and preferred them to the exuberant, avant-garde art of his own era. Fin du siècle Vienna. Here you see, of course, Klimt, Adele Bloch, Bauer, a painting about which Freud wrote nothing, although it was a contemporary of his. And he did not address the art that swirled around him with a dazzling brilliance that failed to gain his attention. But the second model now is the contribution of ego psychology. During Freud's lifetime, other authors made significant contributions. Notable among them was Ernst Kriss, who was a curator in Vienna at the Kunsthistorisches Museum before becoming a psychoanalyst. Kriss emigrated to New York before the Nazi terrors of the Second World War, and in his paper Aesthetic Ambiguity, talks about the complex relationships that exist between artistic production and aesthetic response. He asks, how are these experiences related? Picture once more, this is of course Rembrandt, picture once more the artist who, during the process of creation, simultaneously acts as his own work's first critic. Imagine the painter, motionless, his brush in his hand, contemplating his canvas for a long time in silence. Physically inert, he is hard at work on the painting. He is also communicating with it as its first beholder. Here we have a condensed image of the problem that Kriss is addressing. Aesthetic creation, he said, is aimed at an audience. And he actually defines as aesthetic only those self-expressions that do communicate. And here again, as with Freud, we must be careful, because Kriss does not mean, in a simple way, that the content of the work, separated from its form, communicates. So, it's a painting of a dog, you like dogs, so you like the picture. No. On the contrary, he says communication means far more than some kind of prior intent of the artist. What Kriss means is communication consists in the recreation by the audience of the artist's work. The recreation by the audience of the artist's work. Expressing it in this way, Kriss comes close to the ideas of two American philosophers who were his contemporaries. He never knew them, never read them. John Dewey and Suzanne Langer, who likewise wrote that works of art are best taken as mutual co-creations, and authentic responses to works of art entail contributions of the self. Aesthetic experience is a collaborative, interactive adventure. For Kriss, artists cannot be seen as active while the audience remains passive. Both parties must be seen as active. And the reason this image is so important is because the artist here is the audience. And he, like you, when you look at the painting, he's not painting, but he is painting. He's not painting, but in his mind, he's painting. So it's the same thing that we do when we really, really, really connect with a painting. We repaint it. The painter who remains motionless before his canvas should be understood as fully engaged and active as when he is actually putting the brush to the canvas or mixing the color. This idea matches a central psychoanalytic tenet, namely that the process of treatment, psychoanalytic treatment, the work of therapy, involves a partnership. Two individuals engage, but they need not and cannot be engaged in the same task, and the silence is part of the work. Kriss postulates a similarity between these two processes of artist and audience, but never an identity. turning away from the artist's prior content. By that he means whatever conflicts are in the artist, whatever the artist is, the intrapsychic complexes of the artist, turning away from that, away from any pre-existing condition that must be unearthed. Chris implies that for communication to occur, whatever was emotionally charged for a particular artist at the time of the work's creation need not be the same for the audience. And information about the artist's life and purposes may be completely irrelevant for our appreciation of the work of art. This is absolutely contrary to Freud's notion of pathography, which I just talked about. On the model, this new model, the emphasis shifts from the hidden to the manifest. What matters is what we see, what we actually can see and perceive in the work itself. What is presented to us by that work? How does it resonate with whatever we bring to it in the moments of our interaction with it? An example that springs readily to mind are paintings by the Belgian surrealist painter René Magritte, whose images, here is a painting by him, Les rêveries d'un promeneur solitaire, the thoughts of a person walking alone, walking by himself. His paintings are images highly charged and symbols rich with meaning. When we come upon them, we may be moved to respond to them emotionally. We may find them frightening or even funny or scary or upsetting. But the actual occurrences in Magritte's own life, which caused him to create them, have no necessary connection with the particulars of our own lives. In the case of this artist, some of you may know, he suffered, his mother committed suicide by drowning when he was a boy. And we have many images of water. There was a bridge near his house when he was a child, and the mother, it's thought she maybe jumped from the bridge or she drowned in the River Sample in Belgium near where they lived. And the idea of the man turning away, and he had a fantasy that he saw the body and the nightgown was thrown over the face, and the whole shame of seeing the naked body of the mother was something that we see over and over again. But we don't have to know that, is what the painting is upsetting enough without this knowledge. Central to Chris's approach is the role played by ambiguity. And he has this wonderful idea of the potential of a symbol, he calls it. Symbols in works of art arise from a condensation of many psychic and external factors. Some of them are unconscious. That is to say, repressed or unknown to the artist in other ways. A potent symbol is potent not only because of where it comes from, its genesis, but because it has the power to initiate a process in us. We feel something, and it brings up a lot of associations in us. These two phenomena, the repressed matter within the artist and the repressed matter within any of us, don't correspond. They don't have to correspond. They are never obviously identical. But what matters for Chris is that when you have an artist who can create a powerful symbol like this, then you have something which stimulates some kind of primary process, and a work like this could put us, perhaps, in touch with our own unconscious. And this idea comes close to Freud's idea when he says that a work of art can help us to enjoy our own daydreams without self-reproach. For both Chris and Freud, art offers us a safe domain in which boundaries may be crossed with minimal risk. Chris stresses that to function aesthetically, the symbol has to involve us in a shift from secondary process, which is rational thinking, reason, to primary instinctual, intuitive process. But this condition, he says, very smart, is necessary but not sufficient. And we can easily imagine non-artistic situations. Think of a heated political debate where we have shifts but no aesthetic pleasure. As a corrective, Chris invokes the notion of psychic distance, familiar to philosophers as aesthetic distance. And distance matters because when form and content move too close together, we don't have art, but we have something raw and crude, like pornography or propaganda or magic. And to elaborate this point, the failure of aesthetic distance may turn works of art into fetishes that actually stimulate erotic or political acts. Going beyond Kant and Chris, the experience of aesthetic distance is historically and culturally as well as personally relative. Today we can look at nudes by Titian, by Velázquez, or by Angler. Contemplatively, as one looks at Goya's executions of May 3rd, or at Picasso's Guernica, their distance from us, and their carefully crafted aesthetic, and their ambiguities invite a many-layered response rather than any primitive acting out. When, on the other hand, form and content grow too distant from each other, we feel the art is boring, dry, dull, and we don't care. We don't want to look at it. The greatest art avoids both of these pitfalls. It's neither too close nor too distant, but it manages something in the middle. Therefore, for Chris, the best chances of survival for works of art are works that have what he calls a high degree of interpretability, ambiguity, and they contain within themselves the sources of their integration. When we think of art, I know I'm a teacher, I'm a professor, I'm teaching every year, I'm teaching Greek tragedy, Greek Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. Every year my students are encountering these ancient plays, and every year my students are overwhelmed with the wisdom and the beauty of these great tragedies. This is because they can continue to be interpreted. And this is what he says. How can one highly condensed symbol take on new meaning depending on shifts in the context in which it's placed? Maybe we can think of art originally intended to be religious. Here you have an ecce homo, originally a devotional image, the Christ crowned with thorns, displaying his wounds, meant as a devotional image. Now, where is it? In a museum, where people are walking past and seeing it as a beautiful object, but they are not seeing it in a religious way. So, when it goes into the museum, the same image, hundreds of miles away from where it was originally made, it sheds its spiritual aura, it shifts from sacred to secular. But, by way of compensation, it achieves an enhanced aesthetic, historical, documentary value. And as psychoanalysis would have us understand, still, vestiges of its spiritual meaning continue to inhere, inducing an element of the uncanny. I don't know if any of you have experienced that, but sometimes when you go into a museum, a secular museum, and you see religious images, you have this sense of almost of this uncanny feeling. This image somehow doesn't belong here. or when you go to London and you see the Parthenon, pieces of the Parthenon, you know they don't belong in London, they really belong in Athens, and you have this uncanny feeling. Psychoanalysis is very good to speak about this. Now, another idea of Chris is the notion of regression in the service of the ego. A lot of psychoanalysts don't like this idea anymore, but I think it's very interesting. The notion is that in order to be creative, you have to relax the ego function, the repression, and you have to exercise ego functions, thought, planning, control, critical judgment, and these are important elements of art. So art is purposive and in control, and the artist is able to do that. And he writes about the child. He says the first experience of a child when the child is painting is pure physical pleasure. The child loves to make a mess, just putting the paint everywhere. This is the pleasure of the painting. But suddenly the child, something happens. And there's a moment when the child looks at what he made and he decides that he wants to put blue here. And he wants to put red here. And then that moment of switching from the instinctual pleasure to the purposive pleasure is the moment, or from this moment to this moment, is so important for Chris. He talks about this as now the ego is taking over. And he looks at the marks and he focuses attention. And he's becoming a little artist at that moment. It's not that he doesn't still have pleasure in the color and the brush, but he has something else. The ego function is added. And I think that this is a wonderful contribution of ego psychology to the notion of what the artist is doing. And I think it's very relevant to a lot of the artists that were functioning, such as Josif Albers, who modern, great sort of heroes of modern art. Josif Albers, which his exploration of color relationships, and Mondrian, his concern with graphic structure and design, Broadway Boogie here, and Jackson Pollock, his performances of the elastic relation between freedom and order through the medium of calligraphic line. Activities which involve skill, technique, problem solving, in short, functions of the ego. And another contemporary Freud earlier was Otto Rank. Otto Rank conceives of form as representing what he calls an ego ideal. An ego ideal. So the artistic form embodies the human desire to transcend our given biological and social determinants. If you are a woman in art, you can be a man. If you're a man in art, you can be a woman. Or you're living in the 21st century in art, you can live in the Middle Ages. You can live in the ancient world. You can live somewhere else. You can be something else. And in architecture especially, the attempt of human beings to gain control over aspects of the external environment. And he talks about the way form evolves, he thinks, from biological sources. Spirals, he thinks, from the human intestine. Spirals are ubiquitous forms in all cross-culturally in art. And another psychoanalytic writer, Phyllis Greenacre, writing about the childhood of the artist, talks about the predisposition toward adult experiences in the arts from a sensuality in childhood, child being sensitive to color and form and sound and so on. Before leaving the field of ego psychology, I want to say that I believe that any psychoanalytic approach that depends exclusively on the so-called autonomous functions of the ego would suffer two serious shortcomings. One is it would remove itself from the wellsprings of psychoanalytic thought. the psychoanalytic thought is founded on notions of unconscious conflict and fantasy derived from instinctual pleasures that struggle repeatedly and ingeniously and valiantly against both internal and external resistance. So you need to include that. And the other shortcoming would be that an exclusive preoccupation with form is much too limiting. Formal problems in art are diverting, and their solutions are fascinating, especially to artists, but not all form carries meaning. And I believe for a work of art to be truly great, there must be, as in Freud, a sense of content. That is to say, not merely perception, but a reaching down into the depths of the unconscious. Aristotle understood this when he spoke of the catharsis of pity and fear. And I think the greatest artists of every age have known it. Although we spend many profitable hours dwelling on form and technique in Rembrandt and Goya, Van Gogh, their works have survived because their content is non-trivial. They have painted the deepest fears and wishes of mankind. This is late self-portrait, of course, by Rembrandt, painted in 1660s. He died in 1667. Now, my last one is the object relations theory. This approach is characterized by Winnicott in his very famous paper on the transitional object. Here's a photograph of a baby with a blanket. Winnicott believes that the baby's special blanket, most of you probably know this, the blanket or the soft toy is a precursor of eventual adult investment in many kinds of cultural objects, including works of art. And Winnicott regards the baby's blanket as transitional in a lot of different ways. It is a step along the way to full symbolization. It is transitional in that any question as to whether its soothing properties are inherent or created by the baby remain unanswerable. And it represents a developmental marker between total dependence on the mother and relative independence from the mother. An independence that comes from the internalization of an ego-supportive environment. The child's attachment to a transitional object betokens the fact that the child is well on the way to internalization. And Winnicott sees these attachments as normal and healthy, and he claims that their highly personal significance is a function of whatever cueing goes on, different with every pair in this relationship. From such attachments, Winnicott derives the individual's capacity to invest later on in cultural objects and cultural experiences of all kinds, and to form creative links between the inner and the outer worlds. Like Freud, he cites with great respect children's imaginative play, and he claims that it forms a bridge between infantile illusion or fantasy and aesthetic experience in adulthood. He stresses the question, we must never ask the child about the teddy bear or the blanket. Did you make this or did you find it? Did you make it or did you find it? This is because, like an artist, the child's experience includes both of those modes. Instead of intruding with our reason, we should be complicit in the transformation of the simple blanket or the simple toy into a supremely valued object. Those of you who have small children or small children know that when they have an object and then they lose it, it's very bad. Taking this as a paradigm of our relationships to works of art, we see how a radical separation of form and content would destroy art as art and destroy the experience as aesthetic. It would move us out of the experience. So the experience is reduced to something else, not art. An analogy to psychoanalysis is very apt. The psychoanalyst operates within the boundaries given by the developing dialogue that takes place between two individuals. Ideally, he does not interrupt this privileged space-time to introduce material from outside or to judge the emerging material on ground imported from elsewhere. The treatment seen in this relational, this Winnicottian light, is like a field of play, like the work of art. It comes gradually into being over time during the treatment. One distinctive feature of Winnicott's theory is that whereas Freud concerns himself almost exclusively with intrapsychic processes, Winnicott has this idea of a third area of experience, an intermediate space, he calls it, in which inner and outer, fantasy and reality are mingled. He's alive to the thingness, the objectness of the art object. Transitional phenomena differ from dreams. The blanket is not a dream. It's not a daydream. But it's not just a cup either. It can't be easily controlled. Mothers know what it's like when these things are lost. And Winnicott reminds us that whatever conflicts and secret desires he may have, the artist must cope every day in the studio with paint or stone, or with the vagaries of his computer, or with the technicalities of his camera. And there is a clear interdependence among the various modes of aesthetic experience. Philosophers interested in understanding this have sometimes spoken of experiencing an artwork from within and from without. And most of us, when we visit an art gallery, we alternate between full absorption in the art and return to ourselves, to a consciousness of ourselves. And the aesthetic distance between any composition and ourselves keeps varying as we experience it. This is what I think Winnicott is very interested in. How is it that sometimes we find ourselves fully transported within a work of art, fused with it, and the illusion becomes real when we dwell momentarily in the aura of magic and power created by a work of art? I think Vermeer is probably one of the most beloved painters who ever put a brush to canvas. He is a painter beloved by almost everybody. And when you stand in front of a Vermeer, even though the painting is very small, I think you go into another place. Why? How? These moments are characterized by a deep rapport of subject and object. Another psychoanalyst, Christopher Bollas, says, the subject feels captured in a reverential moment with the aesthetic object. By a spell, I'm quoting, which holds self and other in symmetry and solitude, in which time crystallizes into space, and we experience the uncanny pleasure of being held by a poem, a composition, a painting. And this description returns us to Winnicott, who has described what he calls a holding environment, which mothers create again and again and again for their children. A work of art may create such states of absorption and embrace for its listeners, beholders, and readers, or it may push us away and then open its arms again for another embrace. I think what psychoanalysis offers through the work also of Margaret Mahler on separation, individuation, where she describes where the 2-year-old, the toddler, goes away from the mother and then looks to see if the mother is still there and comes back and then goes away again. It's a developmental model that can explain the power of our experiences with works of art and how they exert long-lasting influences on us. Published work on psychoanalysis and art has long relied on Freudian texts. Among Freud's many papers, there are several. I want to end now by saying that there are several that deserve special mention, but they're usually not referred to. One of them is called Family Romances. This paper offers richly nuanced suggestions about artists' desires for idealization and their need also for devaluation. And it enriches our notions about symbolization by showing us how past and present mutually revise one another in terms of the imagery we remember and invent. Leonardo da Vinci and Memory of His Childhood is arguably Freud's most famous paper, 1910, on art. And despite all of its errors, it continues to enthrall readers. It has spawned a whole shelves of arguments by art historians, for and against, and psychoanalysts. But when you read this paper by Freud and his interpretation of the fact that the artist had 2 mothers, here you have the little Christ child with his mother, Maria, and her mother, Saint Anne, and you see the look on St. Anne's face. And the interpretation of Freud is that this artist had 2 mothers. He had his birth mother, a peasant girl, Katerina, from whom he was torn away by his father and brought to live in a wealthy home with his stepmother. And Freud reads his painting as the artist unconsciously bringing to the painting his own experience as a child with these 2 mothers, the one mother looking jealously at the other mother who actually is reaching out for the child. And even though we don't know how true or false, and so much ink has been spilled over it, the interpretation is so powerful that it's very difficult to go to the Louvre and look at this picture without remembering that interpretation. Wild psychoanalysis cautions authors lest they jump too quickly to conclusions, formulations on the 2 principles of mental functioning. It's another wonderful paper, Mourning and Melancholia, the Uncanny, especially helpful for the work of artists who dwell in trauma, tragedy, and mystery, and perhaps also Note upon a Mystic Writing Pad, Fetishism, and so on. In short, what I want to say to you is that it's not simply the papers that Freud wrote directly about art that could prove useful to us now, these many years later, but the larger corpus of his work, where sometimes in unexpected places he offers stunning insights and struggles to define concepts that may help us grapple with the newly emerging art of our 21st century. So I want to conclude now by saying that the finest, I think, the finest interdisciplinary dialogues between psychoanalysis and art, because there is no clinical agenda, avoid the diagnosis of artists, and they grasp the force of Isaac Bashevis Singer's wry comment that in art, truth is never boring. In art, truth is never boring. Boring is never true. They seek, in parallel with their subject, to draw closer to the font from which imagination springs. They search for intuitive feelings of rightness and never pretend to final solutions. They trade in high degrees of candor, honesty, and suspicion, always suspicious of whether it's really what it seems to be. They know that memory and desire are connected, and they do not privilege reason over unreason, or vice versa. They emphasize the reality of meanings, and they espouse the truth that, like events, meanings too, meanings reverberate throughout history, both personal history and history on a more global scale. They model the importance of studying these meanings as they circulate, collide with, and supersede one another. They enable us to see how it is that we ourselves, by studying these meanings through art and through psychoanalysis, we can take part in changing them, in altering them. When psychoanalytic interpretations adhere to works of art and become internalized, as it were, the works themselves seem to morph, and our aesthetic experience with them modulates as well. And the finest work of this kind, when all is said and done, not only illuminates and changes the objects, but grows itself, matures, and inspires. And like the art, it turns individuals back to our own lives, reanimated, expectant, and renewed. Thank you very much.